And I spent a week hanging out with these gangbangers in El Salvador, in the city of San Salvador, in the capital. And there were times when you could feel the danger. You could just feel the danger. And I was completely right about that. I mean, when I left, slowly, within a few years, most of the people that I had photographed had all been murdered. And I'm really lucky that nothing happened to me, because there were times when I was definitely afraid.
You're listening to The Creative Impostor, episode number 32. Welcome to The Creative Impostor. I'm Andrea Klunder, and today I am really proud and happy to bring you attorney, photographer, creative thinker, visionary, and relatively new podcaster, Jennifer Gardner of RoamHowl. RoamHowl is a show featuring real stories about real people who are up to really good things, and I helped it come into being with Jennifer as my first Podcast Envy VIP guinea pod. I actually feel kind of like a podcast midwife. And before we get too weird with that analogy, I'd like to suggest that you try out audible.com if you haven't already. Really. If you haven't started listening to audiobooks yet, I don't know what on earth you're waiting for. Audible makes it really easy. You can get a free trial and support this podcast at the same time at thecreativeimpostor.com/free book. And I need some new book recommendations, so why don't you pop over to the Creative Impostor Facebook group and share which book you chose as your free one. Again, that's thecreativeimpostor.com/free book to claim your trial of audible.com. And I'd also like to invite you to consider becoming a patron of The Creative Impostor by visiting my Patreon page and making a monthly contribution in any amount commensurate with how you value this show. In exchange, not only will you continue to get more and more episodes from me, you can also get premium episodes not available to the general public, your name in lights on this show, a creative care package in the mail from me, and maybe even a Creative Impostor t-shirt. I'm trying to decide exactly what to put on said t-shirt, so if you can, head over to thecreativeimpostor.com/support and put in your 2 cents. And now, all I really want to say about Jennifer Gardner is that I love working with her because we have the same insatiable curiosity, love to challenge ourselves, and demand high quality in all of our creative pursuits. Plus, she has an incredible voice. After you hear from Jennifer, you are definitely going to want to subscribe to her podcast, RoamHowl, wherever you get your podcasts, and visit her website, which I will link up in the show notes at thecreativeimpostor.com/032. And now, here's my interview with Jennifer Gardner. We met, and we haven't actually met except through the interwebs and by phone and by Skype and by video chat on headphones and on computer screens. But we got connected several months ago because I said a little thing on this podcast, which was, if you have ever thought about starting your own podcast, book a complimentary 20-minute call with me and we'll talk about how you can do that and whether podcasting might be right for you. And you did.
That's right. That's right. Because you said, is there anyone out there who wants to be a guinea pod? And I thought, perfect. That's me. I want to be a guinea pod.
And the reason why is because you did, in fact, want to be a guinea pod and launch your own podcast, which you have done. And you have several episodes out there on iTunes. Tell us what it is.
It's RoamHowl. It's inspiring stories and conversations with multi-talented people. It's all about finding your story and expressing yourself. And I'm interviewing real people doing really good things, like good, cool, interesting things. So that's what my podcast is about, because I'm insatiably curious and I just love to talk to people and find out what makes them tick. They fascinate me. And I want to share what I learn about what their secret for success is with anyone who cares to listen.
And so how did you come up with the name RoamHowl?
That's a good question. I think I was surfing through some emails in my inbox or somewhere on the web about marketing and branding. And I have a little experience with marketing and branding. A prior internet startup I had about a decade ago. And I was thinking in terms of my values and what's important to me. And I was thinking about how I love dogs. And for me, what's important is exploration and discovering stories and communicating. So when I put that layer on top of my love for dogs, I came up with roam because packs of dogs roam around exploring, and howl because that's how they communicate. And that resonated with me. So that's how I came up with the name.
When was the first moment that you thought, I'd like to have a podcast?
I think it must have been sometime last year in May or June. I was listening to a lot of podcasts. We drive a lot here in LA where I live. And so I often tune into podcasts because I'm always curious and want to learn. And I find it a great source of information. And there was one podcast, the first one that I subscribed to was the Diane Rehm Show. And she is this remarkable woman who had an NPR related out of Washington, D.C. interview show. And she covered everything. And I just enjoyed listening to her so much. And as I was downloading back episodes and listening, I discovered more and more about her personally, and I looked her up online. And what inspired me so much about her was that she was doing this and she was in her 80s. And I thought to myself, wow, what a great way to be engaged with the world. And so I thought, she was taking the feed from her show and converting it into a podcast format, or her producers were whoever. I'm just saying the Diane Rehm Show was offered in podcast format. And I don't know, she just inspired me to think, why don't you do this too? Why not?
So you were thinking to yourself, she's doing this. She's 80 something years old. It's an amazing show. I can do this too. And did you just set about right away starting your own show, calling up people and interviewing them? What happened next?
Oh, no, that didn't happen until months later, actually. I had no idea how to do a podcast and I had to figure it out. So I just started talking to people that I knew who had some technical know-how to see if they knew anything. Nobody knew anything. And then I was, again, surfing online. I mean, there's nobody in my pre-existing immediate community who knew anything about how to do this. Nobody. I mean, people in my immediate community have all heard of podcasts, but they've never actually produced a podcast. And so I thought, this is perfect for me because I don't have to be on camera. I don't have to be, although I'm starting to branch out and put myself out there. I just was wondering if I knew anybody with audio expertise, and it turns out I really don't. So I was forced to research online, look at Facebook groups, and I think I found Podcast Movement. Mm-hmm. I found that group and I asked for them to admit me, and they did. And I don't know, one thing led to another. I started asking questions publicly and got some names and some referrals. And I don't even know, Andrea, how I discovered you and your podcast. I'm really not sure, because it's just been miles and miles of clicks that led me to this place, if you know what I mean. Just curiosity, following this lead, following that lead. And now here I am.
That totally makes sense to me. And that is kind of what I think is one of the magical things about podcasting, is that I couldn't tell you how I discovered probably 85% of the podcasts that I listen to. And that can range from anything from highly produced podcasts like NPR style or WNYC Studios to, someone doing it out of their converted pantry like me, who has a few hundred downloads per episode per month. And maybe it's somebody across the country who I have no connection to whatsoever. But that's kind of one of the magical, mysterious things about podcasting, is that there is this way in which you sort of filter and find and collect this community of people who all are curious and who all like to learn about things and hear about different things and find different perspectives. And it doesn't surprise me that you went about sleuthing this whole process out in the way that you did, because I know what your full-time career is, which is...
I'm a lawyer. I'm a litigating lawyer. Like, I try jury cases and I hear cases.
I was just going to say, and so you have so much free time on your hands to learn how to be a podcaster.
Let me tell you, every minute of waking time is jam-packed right now.
And that's kind of how you like things to be, because besides the curiosity factor, I know that you describe yourself as a multi-passionate, multi-talented person. So how is it that you balance having a full-time law practice with pursuing podcasting and your other passions, which we haven't even talked about yet?
Right. Well, the other passions are sort of on the back burner for now, because launching the podcast has been a very all-consuming diversion from my main gig. It's a very consuming side hustle, let's put it that way. And so I've had to put a lot of other things on the back burner so I can really concentrate on doing excellent legal work for my clients, which I am completely 1,000% committed to, in addition to learning how to podcast and rolling this thing out.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you find the time, manage the time, figure out your schedule? Like, what is the secret, Jennifer?
People ask me that it's pretty funny. You know, I get these comments, you do so much. It makes me think, but mostly I'm just too busy doing to think about why. I just want to be in the doing because I enjoy it. I feel so alive, enjoying learning and doing and achieving and helping people. I don't mean to sound cliche, but that in my law practice is my focus. And then I'm a part-time administrative law judge for LA County, and that's part-time. It's very part-time. It can sometimes be super busy, and then I can have several months without a case, but that's public service. So, I mean, I guess it's just the way I choose to be engaged with the world. I love to get a pedicure and a facial, but it's really, those are the things that suffer. You know, I don't neglect my health, but, you know, pedicures and manicures, I don't really have time for that. So, yeah, I guess you could say I'm just really enjoying living my life so fully and feeling myself express and use and stretch to use and grow and develop every part of myself. It's an orientation. And I'm really independent. You know, I have friends, I am married, but I enjoy this time that I spend in discovering, which always leads to self-discovery. So I guess, did I answer your question?
Did I ask a question? I'm just listening.
I think you did.
I'm just listening to what you're saying, and I'm like, yeah, that sounds so wonderful. I think that I originally asked how you balance everything and how you find time to do everything. And I think the answer is that you just follow what feels really good and inspiring and what helps you feel alive, and that you're just so engaged in the things that you're doing that you kind of just make it happen.
Absolutely. I make it happen. I have help. I know how to ask for help. I need to get better at it, but I try to delegate. There's always room for improvement there because I have really high standards. So it's hard to let it go. It's hard to give it to other people to do for me. But I've learned to say no. You know, there are cases that I don't take anymore. I've said no a lot in the last 6 months so that I could focus on RoamHowl and on the existing work and clients in my office. Mm-hmm. And I don't get a heck of a lot of sleep.
Yeah.
I really don't. Even at the end of the day, I'm learning, listening, watching, just intrigued.
And are there any specific things that you do? Because I know that you said, you know, maintaining your health is important, and obviously keeping your energy levels up is important. Is there anything specific that you are doing consciously to maintain good health and energy?
Yeah, a number of things. I don't eat a lot of sugar. I don't eat white flour. I try to get intense cardio for 50 minutes twice a week. I work out with weights once a week. I ride my horse vigorously twice a week. And I have enough work, so I'm not stressing about not having enough work. I try to make sure I put the energy into making sure I have enough work of the kind of work I want to do for the people who I enjoy working for. And then I make sure that I have time to pursue these other interests of mine, because I really need it all. They all inform each other. If I'm lawyering overtime, and there are times when I have to do that, for example, when I'm getting ready for a trial or I'm writing a big brief, then I start to get even a stronger urge to indulge the more what people would consider typically creative side of myself. So, for example, I want to make art, or I want to do this podcast. Like right now, the podcast project is scratching the creativity itch big time. And then honestly, I get steeped in the podcast work, developing the website, developing marketing, learning about that, learning about how I'm going to launch it. And then I frankly need to take a break from that and go back and do my main gig. I mean, they really inform each other. And it's always been that way with me. Always.
Mm-hmm. So you do all these different things, which include lawyering, which I've never actually heard it phrased that way as a verb. I like that. Lawyering. I don't know why.
Good.
I just like the way that sounds. So you do all these different things, including lawyering, including the business and entrepreneurial side of running your practice, including producing the podcast. You also, though it's on the back burner, you also are a photographer. And you also do some theater training and theater classes. Is that right?
That's right.
And you have all these different interests, and you're definitely somebody who has, like you said, a very high standard for quality. And that's something that I know from working with you on your podcast on RoamHowl. I know that you and I work well together because we both aren't satisfied until something is exactly right. Even if
exactly
someone else might think, oh, that's okay, we can just put it out. We're like, no, it needs to be right.
No. I know. And I love that you get that. And I love that you're such a hard worker too. And you're smart. And I can defer to you. Like, we have a question about keep it or not, and I defer to you. I mean, I feel like I'm driving a Bentley, to be quite honest, when I work with you. It's awesome.
Wow. That's like the best testimonial I've ever heard.
Wow. You can thank Bentley, I guess. Not that I've ever driven a Bentley, but, I have a fantasy of what it would be like to drive a Bentley. So,
There you go. I can't say that I have either.
I sat in one. It was pretty amazing.
Just sitting. But what I wanted to ask about this high standard for the quality of work that you do, in addition to the variety of work that you do, and in addition to the pure volume of work that you do, are you always confident going into a new venture that it's going to be up to your standard and that you're going to be amazing at it and that it's going to work out the way that you want it?
Absolutely not. I'm not sure. I'm learning to be more confident in myself. I'm learning to give myself more credit for my accomplishments. I'm pretty self-deprecating and I'm very hard on myself. I'm probably harder on myself than anybody else could ever be. And I definitely don't have that confidence, but I really enjoy the fear. Well, confronting the fear, I should say. I don't enjoy the fear. I enjoy going through it because I find that that's where life is. It's confronting what you're most terrified of and working through it and getting to the other side of that. So I'm confronting my fear all the time, almost every day. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I feel so alive. It's just, swinging from limb to limb, literally. And as I learn to work through the fear, and I have discovered the power of not being afraid to express my fearfulness, and, some people call that vulnerability, there's this tremendous possibility of connecting with everybody that I come into contact with, whether it's the person that I get a coffee from at Starbucks or the clerk in the courtroom, or the parking attendant in the garage where I'm parking my car, or the judge who's hearing my motion, or the guest who's appearing on my show. There's something about going through the fear and allowing yourself to be real about the fear and vulnerable and open about it that leads to greater connection. And I really think that it's that connection that sustains me.
I'm wondering, okay, number one, how many interviews have you recorded for RoamHowl at this point?
5.
Okay. And would you say the first interview was the most terrifying?
Yes, but I set it up so it would be a little less terrifying because I chose to interview one of my most fascinating friends.
Smart. And what was that like? Like, how did you feel plugging in your ATR microphone for the first time and putting on the headphones and dialing up Skype? Like, what was happening for you in that moment?
I was afraid that I was going to screw something up. I wasn't going to plug everything in right. And then I was so nervous about asking the questions and not sounding completely stupid as I asked the questions, and then not sounding like a lawyer as I asked the questions, because it's a different kind of a conversation. I mean, I'm not examining someone, although the way that I examine and I've been trained to examine is probably very different than the typical idea that people have about how lawyers examine and cross-examine witnesses. I mean, I'm much more conversational than the average lawyer, but I found that, wow, asking questions in an interview format that's non-adversarial, where there's no conflict and it's really just for fun and informational purposes, is a totally different thing in some ways. And then in other ways, it's totally the same. I don't cross-examine or conduct a direct examination in a way that's punishing or heavy-handed because I'm compassionate with whoever is in front of me. I mean, that's just my style.
In both scenarios, you're being authentically you, even though the task at hand is different.
Exactly.
And so with that first interview, when you had all these, things going through your mind about whether you were going to set everything up right and asking the questions in such a way that you sounded authentically like you, but you didn't sound like a lawyer, but you still got everything across. What did you do to get through that interview? Can you even remember?
Oh, yeah. First, I prepared. And even though I interviewed my friend, I still did research on his background, his career. And then I came up with a list of questions. I would say I researched those questions too. And these are questions that I give to all my guests in advance that I've culled them and sort of modified them from other questions that I've either heard being asked on podcasts or I've seen asked in a book or a magazine, questions that really intrigued me where I really wanted to know the answer to those questions. And so I made a list and I give those to my guests before I do the interviews. And that's basically how I got ready.
And now I imagine that interviewing your friend for your first podcast is pretty low stakes risk compared to some of the risks that you've taken or experiences that you've had as a trial attorney. And this is backtracking a little bit, but I know that one of the themes that's important to you in RoamHowl is that sometimes we compartmentalize creative and not creative in terms of the type of work that we're doing, or in terms of a career, or in terms of a person who is either a creative or not a creative, and that sometimes we have these preconceived categories. And I imagine that some people would not, if you said, make a list of some creative careers or careers that creatives can have, I imagine that some people would not put being an attorney in that creative category.
I think you're right.
But I also imagine that being a good trial attorney requires you to be extremely creative.
Well, yeah, that's the irony. It took me years to really realize that, but it is so creative because people come to you usually in a crisis, and they can't see the forest for the trees, and they don't know, in most cases, what legal procedure is or what the law even says. They just have a sense of something's happened and they need to get through it, and something right needs to happen to correct the situation. I don't care what side of the equation you're on. That's what's motivating them. They want justice, but they have no idea how to get that. And I sort of have to take it apart piece by piece and sort through all of that, and then take what happened and put it together in a cogent, persuasive, compelling way. I have to discover their stories. I have to help them discover their stories. They often don't even know or know what the dynamics were that even led them to get into this dispute or problem in the first place. So that is incredibly creative. And then writing it and assembling the evidence in a way that's going to make a compelling presentation. That's what I'm doing all the time. It's incredibly creative. I actually enjoy that part of it.
Circling back around to this idea of risk-taking and high stakes and self-confidence and fear, can you think of a specific time or a specific trial or something where you really just felt out of your element, or you felt a high level of that fear, or dare we even say imposter syndrome?
Sure. I question myself all the time, but I think that makes me a better lawyer because I'm never complacent. I never think, oh, that's it, I got this. I never want to underestimate my opponent or what might happen, or how I know from doing this work for a very long time and having a lot of trials that the case you start with is never the case you finish with, that someone else or a jury of 12 someone else's will see something in a completely different way. They can pick up on things that the parties and their lawyers in the court didn't see, and the court may see the problem in a totally different way than we see it. So I would say I'm always questioning and doubting, but I think in a way that's my strength.
What's the most challenging moment that you can think of from your career or from one of your other creative passions and pursuits in which you could say, I definitely felt like an imposter in that moment?
Well, I've had so many challenging moments as a lawyer, but it helps that I'm improvisational and well-rounded, because I have a lot of personal resources that I can draw on to deal with those things. And I have colleagues and lawyers that I work with and consult with regularly who can help me talk me through a problem that may seem bigger than something I can solve on my own. And I'm never afraid to ask for assistance. I feel like I owe it to my clients if I ever feel that I am in something that could be even slightly over my head. But I can tell you, as a photographer, when I was doing the social documentary portraiture, there were times where I was, quite frankly, very afraid for my safety and thought, oh my goodness, I've really gotten myself in a little deep here.
What is social documentary portraiture?
Well, basically what I was doing was this is going back a ways, but I was taking portraits of subjects. I was self-financing these photojournalistic explorations of populations of people, communities of people that were social outcasts, you might say. So I photographed these homeless Hollywood kids that were part of this gutter punk scene here in Los Angeles. And that work was exhibited pretty widely and internationally about 20 years ago. I can't even believe it was that long ago because it feels like it was yesterday. And when it was published, my phone started ringing. People saw these magazines and tracked me down and said, you have to come photograph our community of people. So one such call that I got was from a person working with repatriated Los Angelino gang members from El Salvador who, upon their release from prison here in Los Angeles for committing, really heinous crimes in many cases, were put back on a plane and flown to El Salvador. They were repatriated or deported or whatever you want to call it, and not allowed to re-enter the United States again. And they often found themselves, they had left as kids as refugees with their parents. And some of them didn't even speak Spanish anymore. And then there they were, released from prison back to their country of origin. And I went to photograph a group of them they were still in gangs, but they were working to end the gang violence because I don't know if you know or not, but El Salvador, with everything that's going on everywhere else, including in the Middle East, El Salvador is considered, I think, the most violent country in the world. And so I went there not knowing anybody except this one contact that I had who was a anti-death penalty activist, Magdalena Rose Avila. And he picked me up at the airport, and I spent a week working with his people. And so hanging out with these gangbangers in El Salvador, in the city of San Salvador, in the capital. And there were times when you could feel the danger. You could just feel the danger. And I was completely right about that. I mean, nothing happened when I was there. I had an amazing, amazing experience. But when I left, slowly, within a few years, most of the people that I had photographed had all been murdered in gang retribution killings.
Wow.
And yeah, it's so sad. Like for things that had happened in Los Angeles many years before, nothing that had even happened in El Salvador. It's just the gang violence was exported back to that country and just lives on. So I was spending time. I mean, I was totally immersed in their lives. I was going to their homes and going to their meetings and going to their events and hanging out with them and, going to clubs and eating rice and beans and, in restaurants and cafes. And it was a fascinating, wonderful experience. And I'm really lucky that nothing happened to me because there were times when I was definitely afraid.
I've been to El Salvador twice.
Wow.
And my best friend was in the Peace Corps in a tiny remote community several hours away from San Salvador. And I met some very wonderful people there. And there's so many beautiful things about that culture. And there were questionable moments where I thought to myself, well, I don't know if getting in the back of this pickup truck to get from point A to point B is really the best idea, but there doesn't seem to be another option. So this is just how it's done. One thing that I experienced, especially the second time that I was down there, and I was only down there, each trip for me was 10 days, and my friend was down there for, I think, slightly over 2 years. One thing that I did the second time was we did sort of a cultural exchange project for the community whereby I connected people in my community and in my world in the U.S. We took up a Spanish language children's book donation and brought it to the community so that their school could have a library. And we took donations to establish a milk fund in their elementary school so that the kids could have, because they were just eating rice for lunch for their school lunches. And so we had asked the school if the kids could have a more nutritious lunch, what do you wish they could have? And they all wanted milk. So we started this milk fund. And there were times when I would have sort of this little voice in the back of my mind, like, what are you doing here? Like, what do you think you know about helping these people? Or you don't really belong here. Or do you really know what you're doing? Is what you're doing really helping? Does it really make sense? Or is it just some weird form of charity that you came up with that may or may not have any impact on their life? Did you ever have those feelings of like, what on earth am I doing here in the midst of that project?
Absolutely. Like from the moment I got off the plane, I felt so vulnerable, and I was around these men who one by one confessed to me what they had done that led to their gang membership and that led to their ultimate incarceration. And believe me, they were incarcerated for one fraction of the horrific things they had done. And they were recovering from that. They were traumatized by the circumstances that led them to commit the crimes they committed. I mean, that's part of the reason why they were all so willing to talk to me. It's sort of how they heal themselves, by talking about what their experiences were, sharing that information. And for me, I mean, I felt in the very beginning, before I knew these people, like, oh my God, I am in a house in a neighborhood in the middle of San Salvador with a bunch of murderers, and I'm a female and I'm alone. And how the hell, I mean, is anybody going to find me were something to happen, there was a time, there was like, especially the first day of the project where I was terrified. Yeah, definitely. There were many such occasions. And then it would be contrasted with being invited to a Peace Corps / State Department / expat party in some gated community where there were all these Americans that were yucking it up and drinking beer. And the contrast between that and what daily life looks like for the majority of the people who are Salvadoran, the contrast was just, surreal.
Mm-hmm. And so do you feel like those risks, in the end, do you feel like it paid off for you, that it was a really worthwhile project?
Oh, yeah. When I was first photographing, I sought out those kinds of encounters. I wanted to be a war correspondent for many years. And it's a long story why I never made that segue, but it was during a time in my life where I was younger and also in a lot of emotional pain. And there's something about that combination of feeling like nothing bad can happen to you and the painful place that I found myself in, where it's not that I didn't care if it did, and it's not that I wasn't afraid, but it made me more willing to risk because I suppose I felt I had less to lose. I don't know. It's been a while since I've really thought about how I felt back then, but that was definitely a component. Mm-hmm. But I really loved the adrenaline rush. RoamHowl is a very safe, middle-aged way for me to be scratching the same itch. And it's one of the reasons why I've loved being a lawyer. I get to enter people's lives, really examine the interior, the details, immerse myself in it, feel what it's like, communicate about it in a passionate way, and then step outside of it and go back to my own world.
And going back to this legal practice that you are in, how long have you had your own practice?
25 years.
Wow. And before that, you were doing...
I was litigating, and I had a couple jobs in smaller firms, and I was a young associate, and I was working very hard, and I had no life, and I realized, my goodness, they're handing me these cases that are involving complex human relationships. And how am I ever going to be able to advise clients without life experience of my own? And the demands of working in these law firms were such that all I was doing was working, researching, writing, talking to people, interviewing clients, drafting motions and pleadings. And I felt like I can't really serve these people with no life experience. So I needed to create the space to get that kind of experience so I could be a more effective lawyer, an advocate.
And just how male-dominated is the law profession right now?
Well, I haven't looked at the statistics in a while, but generally I think that what happens is the enrollments for female students are up. But then a lot of women find the demands of having a family very incompatible with being in the profession. And gradually you see a drop-off of a lot of women after they graduate, like 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later. They migrate to other fields or they just become full-time moms. I have a couple friends who didn't do that. They had families with, many children and managed to continue to practice and have thriving, robust, satisfying legal careers. But I think that there are a lot of statistics that show that women don't stay in the field. So it was originally male dominated. Like when I was there were a lot of men, mostly men, not a lot of women. And these days, I think that there are more women, but there's still this sense of male domination definitely in the partnership tiers at the firms and in the courtrooms that I go to. You see mostly men. You still see mostly men. I was there this morning. I can tell you I saw mostly men.
Do you feel like that affects you at all? Or I don't know if you would necessarily call yourself a feminist, but I know that you have an interest in feminism and women's issues and advocacy and things like that. Do you feel any kind of effects from being immersed in a male-dominated world? And by the way, podcasting also is. But do you feel any effects, or do you feel like you've had to work harder?
Yeah, I think I've had to work harder, and I still think I continue to work harder, and I think I continue to earn less than my peers. I do. My male peers. Absolutely. I think it's getting a lot better, though, slowly over time.
Why are people in so much denial about the fact that women earn less than their male peers, equally qualified women? How is that not just like a fact?
I don't know. It's like we've been having this conversation for years, and the statistics still demonstrate that. It's mind-blowing to me, but it's getting better. And what's also better is me. I stop thinking about myself and differentiating myself. As I feel more connected to more and more people on a human level, I don't see color and race and religion and gender as being something that separates me. Mm-hmm. And that has to do with my perspective. Mm-hmm. And it's my mindset and how I, go out into the world. But having said that, I am sensitive to the fact that there's definitely pockets where the bias persists. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of things that are veering a little bit to the social political spectrum in terms of equal pay and in terms of women's issues and in terms of what you just said about how you really take it upon yourself to connect with people on a very, did you say humanist? Is that the word that you use?
Yeah.
On a very
authentic and human level.
Mm-hmm, on an authentic humanistic level. And how when you do that, it's more about us as individuals, not us as a representative category or a race or an ethnicity or a gender or something like that. And there's a lot happening, obviously, understatement of the century. There's a lot happening in our social political climate here in the U.S. that I think has always been happening around these kinds of issues, gender issues, race issues, xenophobia, things like that. But it's all rising to the surface so quickly and so in front of everyone's eyes all at the same time. And I know right before we started our official interview, I asked you if you would be comfortable talking at all about your perspective on what's happening here in our political system from the point of view of an attorney. And so I'm just curious, what are you observing? What are you noticing? And is all of this affecting you on a personal level in terms of your work?
It totally affects me. It's hard to express. I haven't been asked this question, so I'm just going to speak spontaneously. I was in court this morning and I thought to myself, wow, we have ways of behaving in court. We're supposed to be, we're not always, but in a courtroom, it's pretty civilized. And the discourse is intellectual. And when you're pleading a case or making an argument, you may talk about real facts and real people. I mean, that's basically what it all comes down to, what happened and who the people are whose lives are involved. And even if it's a company you're litigating for or against, companies are people after all. And there's something about that environment that's very near and dear to me because you can go there and you can express yourself. You can have your turn to speak. And there's a safety in that. Once you get in the door, you get your shot. And there's a safety and a beauty to that I've never appreciated quite in the same way. And I don't think it's just because I'm socialized to think this, but I do respect judges. I have tremendous respect for judges. And I think that what's happening right now, watching the judiciary be denigrated is very sad and very upsetting. But I also think that the judiciary and all the minorities in this country are bigger than any other force and more powerful. And I do have confidence in the power of these institutions and in people, the power of people. I don't feel crushed. I'm upset, but I think we're going to be fine.
And what do you think? I don't know if you've thought specifically about this, but this is something that's been on my mind. What do you think is the role of creatives, people who are more creatively minded? What do you think is our role in this moment in history? Because I think after I spent, weeks trying to hide under the covers and scrolling through Facebook, making myself feel worse.
Yes.
And thinking about all of the activist-oriented things that I should be doing that I'm not doing, and berating myself about that. After I moved through that stage, I started to think there has to be an opportunity here. Like, it's not always horrible. There's always some kind of opportunity. So what do you think is the opportunity for creatively minded people in this time, in this moment?
Well, if you have a real feeling about what's going on and you don't like it, it certainly gives you access to something that you can use for your art. And actually, I have friends who are artists who are doing just that. I mean, they're making amazing pieces that are so reflective of the time that we're in that maybe they wouldn't have made a few months ago. And I'm noticing that it's just really fueling their creativity, just making them want to say more. And I think that I don't want to go so far as to say I think that creative people have a responsibility to do that, but I think it's a really positive way to process whatever it is you're feeling.
Mm-hmm. The other question that I like to ask everyone is, if someone's listening to this podcast right now and they're thinking about jumping outside of the box and trying a new venture or taking another risk or putting themselves in a situation that may be out of their comfort zone, but has a potential for a great payoff for them personally, professionally, creatively, whatever that might be. And maybe that person is feeling that imposter voice creeping in saying, maybe that's not for you, or maybe you don't really know how to do that, or maybe you're not really going to be that great at that. You should probably try something else, or go back and get another degree or another certification. What advice would you have for that listener?
You got to dive in and build it while you drive it. Take the leap.
Drive that Bentley.
Exactly. Well, it may start out as a Volkswagen, or maybe it just has the Volkswagen chassis, and then you add on, and then you replace parts, and you revise and you modify. But I mean, I suffer from this myself, but I'm learning to make these calculations faster and faster because, I'm frankly getting older, and who knows how long I'm going to have this kind of energy and drive. But I think that we have to just jump in and try things and risk and create things and get rid of our fear of failure and understand that failure is part of it and learn from those failures, but take the risk, take the leap. Everybody, by the way, I've only had 5 interviews, but I've talked to several more people who are all going to be on the show on RoamHowl, and they all say that when I ask them that question, they all talk about not hesitating in spite of their fear, moving forward quicker in spite of their fear. They all wish that they had taken the leap and done what they really wanted to do faster than they did. So that would be my advice to anyone who's thinking of trying something, stepping out of their comfort zone. For me, that's how you know that you're really alive, when you're doing it. It's the thrill of the doing.
So deeply inspired by Jennifer's creative insights and by her faith in working with me on the RoamHowl podcast. You can, of course, connect with Jennifer through her show, her site, and the usual social platforms, and they will be linked in the show notes at thecreativeimpostor.com/032. Along with links to get your free audiobook from Audible, become a Creative Impostor patron via Patreon, say that 5 times fast, and learn more about how you can work with me to launch your own podcast via my forthcoming Podcast Envy program, which will begin in May of 2017. There are 5 spots available to become part of the first launch pod. To learn if one of those spots should be yours, schedule a free pod dreaming consultation with me, linked in the show notes, or at thecreativeimpostor.com/connect. Right now, you can get a free download of my audio training, 5 ways to expand your reach with podcasting, and get the 411 lowdown on more Podcast Envy opportunities online and in Chicago as they become available. This episode was mixed by Edwin Ruiz of Mondo Machine. Theme music by Jovia Armstrong. Go listen to RoamHowl. and I wish you a week filled with curiosity and creative risk-taking.